Welcome, everybody, to WTAF. I'm Danielle, and I have Dr. John Matthias and his wife, Lauren, on the phone. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Of course. Thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know, Dr. John and Lauren have an amazing podcast called Hidden. It's called Hidden, a True Crime Podcast. And earlier in the chat, I dropped the links. I'll drop them again so everybody can check out their podcast. It's amazing. Thank you guys for doing such a wonderful job. I've listened to a couple episodes so far. I'm running a little behind in life right now, but the episodes I have listened to are phenomenal.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Welcome. You're welcome. They're so informative, and you guys are taking a deep dive into the Lori Vallow case.
Yes, we are, to say the least. Really.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourselves before we get started?
Yeah, absolutely. I am Lauren Matthias. I'm a journalist. I spent nearly a decade as a TV reporter and actually started my career in East Idaho near Rexburg, where Chad Daybell land, and finished, most recently was with Salt Lake City. And I was a TV reporter and anchor in Boise, Idaho, when John and I were set up. And he was in Vegas and I was in Boise. My cousin set us up, and I thought, okay, blah, blah, I'll talk to him briefly, I guess. And then we were on the phone for 3 hours the first time. And I think we talked about crime. The first time we met, he mentioned to me that he was a forensic psychologist and forensic and clinical psychologist. And when I learned that he interviewed criminals and assessed criminals, I was just like, yes, I will marry you. So he could tell you a little bit about his background.
Yeah, Lauren thought it would be romantic to bring up a murder case she was working on. The guy was
That's perfect.
Yeah, right. I know. It was quite attractive, I have to say. But so she told me all about this guy, Adam Dees, who randomly walked into a home and killed everyone, and
this was our first conversation.
Yeah, that was our first conversation ever. So we always think maybe we'll go back to that case and take a look at it, but it was solved pretty quickly because they found him the next day. But so I'm Dr. John, and I've been a forensic psychologist now since 1996. That was the year I did my first psychosexual evaluation. Some of the listeners may know that term because psychosexual evaluations were actually involved in the Cox Vallow situation. I'm sure you know that, Danielle. But so I've done a lot of psychosexual evaluations. I've done violence risk assessments. I've done substance abuse risk assessments, mental health assessments, mental health evaluations. I've done work for DAs. I've done work for defense attorneys. Generally speaking, I prefer to be on the prosecution side of things if I can. But more recently, in the last 3 years, I've taken on a handful of cases for the defense because I feel like the sentences were unfair and there were some things I thought I could help with. And so I feel like it's rare, but when there are certain injustices, I like to get on the other side of things. I've probably done now, I don't know, over 500 evaluations over the years. I am also a federal expert witness. So I get called in on federal cases when they need experts, and I've done expert witness testimony for the DA in Las Vegas a handful of times on a few high-profile cases.
And then fast forward to his background and my background. December 2019, when I first learned about Chad and Lori, we talk a lot about crime, and we were actually planning a podcast, and I learned about Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, and I ran to John and I was like, John, 2 kids are missing. This is insane. and we haven't stopped talking about it since. So that changed the total direction of our podcast.
We'd been talking about doing a true crime podcast for a number of years, but then this case came up, and then the coronavirus hit, which meant that, for me at least, I could not get into prisons and jails as much, so I had more free time, and a number of circumstances came together to make this happen. So
we're here to answer your Lori, Vallow, Chad, Daybell questions. Our podcast is called Hidden because we all talk about the motives, sex, money. Those are the motives we always talk about. We talk about the hidden motives, what's behind the motives we talk about. We dig deeper with Dr. John, able to answer a lot of questions. So we're here to answer some questions you might have.
Yeah, I think one of our frustrations initially, we love Dateline and we love 48 Hours. We love all the true crime shows and watch them all the time, but we feel like they're not going deep enough. We feel like they're not answering those deeper questions.
Yeah, they just skim the surface, those shows, for sure. We have Christina here with us too. I gotta unmute her mic here. Hey, Christina.
Hi.
Hello.
For anybody in the chat, Christina is part of WTAF as well. So just like you, Dr. John and Lauren, Christina actually is the one who first posted the flyer of Tylee and JJ in one of our Facebook groups.
Wow.
And we went through a deep dive into this case. And I think her and I have spoken about this case, along with everybody else on our team, probably like no other case we've ever spoken about, because there's just so much.
Yes, there is.
There. I don't know what question to start with first. I know like I said, I've listened to a couple of your podcasts. I am very interested in hearing your input and your professional opinion on Lori having borderline personality disorder and how that plays a role in Tylee and JJ's murders. Essentially, everybody calls them murders. I think we all know that they were murdered, but technically there's no murder charges yet. So
Right. Yeah, so we have to be a little careful with that, I guess.
We're getting a bit of an echo. Does it come across on your end, or are we okay talking?
I think you guys are okay. It seems to be echoing with Christina, but I'll mute my mic and I think you guys will be okay.
Okay, great. So go ahead, John.
So, I talk a little bit in the podcast about how I try to stay away from diagnosis because there's this thing called the Goldwater Rule, which prohibits psychologists and psychiatrists, or doesn't prohibit, but it suggests that we're not supposed to diagnose without actually meeting someone and doing a clinical interview or a forensic interview and doing some testing. But in this case, in the psychosexual evaluation from 2007, the evaluator did an interview with Lori, and the female evaluator, actually suggested that she receive a diagnosis of borderline or histrionic personality disorder. So I'm kind of piggybacking on that. Obviously, I haven't met with Lori, so I can't diagnose directly, but I think based on the evidence we have and what we've seen and looking at all the behaviors we've seen from her, I think it's a pretty fair assumption to say that she has borderline personality disorder. Why would that be relevant to the murders? The most interesting work I've seen on that is by a psychiatrist by the name of Carl Malmquist. I talked about him in our podcast where we talk about this issue, which is episode 8. And basically the way Malmquist summarizes it is he says, borderlines are impulsive and they're particularly prone to rage. So rage is a huge feature of borderline. So I think that's what puts her at risk for murder, is she has this explosive rage that's unpredictable. And people have talked about this, including Charles, Vallow. At any moment she can flip the switch from calm to rage, and who knows what she's capable of doing in those moments.
That's interesting. One of our members, subs down in the chat, asked, who leads, Chad the author or Lori the more experienced with eliminating people in her way? Do you have an opinion on that? Do you think Chad was the instigator to this, or was it a combination, or was it Lori?
Yeah, I know that's
We definitely have an opinion.
Yeah, that's the question everyone wants to know. It's and we're going to be talking about this in our episode that's coming up this week. Actually, we're going to try to put as many pieces together as we can and reach a conclusion on that. But there's definitely a synergy between the two of them. But Chad, I think, and we've talked to some sources really close to the situation, and they tell us that Chad is the mastermind. We know in the Melanie Gibb interview with Nate Eaton that she referred to Chad as being the hand and Lori as the glove. So Melanie's on the inside. She obviously has seen things up close. I think without Chad's belief system and without his views, his religious views, none of this happens, right? Because it's all based on that framework of his New Jerusalem and his view of the afterlife. Everything centers around that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
We start our podcast explaining that because that's the question that everyone has, and it's the first thing that John said. He said that we've talked to people who validated what John always thought. I want to say we have been saying this since the beginning, or John has always told me Chad is the mastermind. He's the oracle that he's telling people what to do. He's behind this. And it's just been confirmed more and more. But John early on wrote a big blog about that he shared on some of the Facebook groups, explaining why that is so. And we started our podcast explaining that.
Okay. Christina, do you have anything you want to ask?
Do you have an opinion on why Chad is the way he is?
Yeah, yes, we do. How long do we have?
Yeah. So we're again, we're gonna break that down in our upcoming episode. But we've learned a lot about the Daybell family since we did our first podcast on Chad, and it's interesting. It's not a super dysfunctional family, but it's fairly dysfunctional in the sense that we now know that the majority of kids in that family have had drug addictions or substance abuse problems. And typically that indicates that there's a problem regulating emotions in the family. So I think that Chad really struggles to, people have commented on how flat he is and does he have autism? And I think all of that is probably related to the fact that Chad lacks any type of emotional intelligence. He has very little empathy. He's self-absorbed. He has a lot of narcissistic traits. I think all of those, grew out of a family environment that was adequate, but not particularly nurturing. So I think Chad was in this environment where he wanted a lot of attention and he wasn't getting it. It's not that there was abuse going on. It's just that he wanted more than he could get from that family. So we have stories that show where he was kind of fame obsessed from an early age. He was really concerned about being known and being recognized. And I think all of that plays into this. All of that is going to later grow into something that gets out of control.
Yeah, I think I've said it a couple times. I think this case, when it's said and done, it will probably be a show that has like 10 seasons or more because there's no wrapping your head around it unless you understand every little detail.
Yeah.
Madam Deficit asks, who do you think holds the power in the relationship now with Lori and Chad, and who do you think is most likely to turn on the other if they would? Do you think that's a
We discuss this a lot in our home, by the way. We answer this a lot.
We just talked to someone today, and again, we have to really be careful about our sources, but we just talked to someone today who had pertinent information about the fact that it looks like Chad's defense might be prepared to throw Lori under the bus. So, but Lori seems to be smitten with Chad still. So, I don't know how accurate that is. Obviously, we're not meeting with them in jail, but it appears that in terms of power, I guess I would suggest that Chad is still trying to exert power, but it does appear that Chad is more willing at this point to use Lori to try to mount a defense that could benefit him.
Let me suggest this though too. A trait of borderline, and John can explain this better, but a trait of those with borderline personality disorder is that they will be smitten with someone one moment, whether that's a friendship or a romantic partner, and the next moment completely turn on them. And we can see that with Lori already. One moment she loves her kids, and the next moment they're buried in Chad Daybell's backyard. So she could turn quickly. Yeah. And that's part of this too. It seems like right now she is still smitten with Chad, but she could turn in a day's time.
Right. And essentially, Lori is the one who was responsible for her children. Chad was not.
Absolutely.
So he might, I don't know that he could use that as a legal out, but she has to explain how her two children ended up, one of them dead, dismembered, burned, and buried in her new husband's backyard, and the other one dead and wrapped in duct tape and trash bags. So that burden, I don't think, falls on Chad, does it?
Well, I would imagine. I don't know. Again, I don't know what the DA has, what their argument, what the prosecution will say, but that's true. There's no murder charges anywhere at the moment, so maybe they don't have enough to charge Chad. But I mean, the text about the raccoons and the cell phone pinging on the property around the time the bodies were buried that they can tie to Chad. I mean, I think there's definitely some stuff here that would make him an accomplice.
Right. I think one thing we have here from Pretty Close is they have so much the public doesn't even know.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting whose DNA is going to be on the duct tape. Who's, what's going to be found where. We don't know what they have, and I think a lot will depend.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think this is something we spoke to you on the phone about earlier. Let me find it really quick. Carolyn Michelle Dunn asked, do you have any insight into the relationship between Lori and Alex? I've heard it's a little too close. Pryor seemed to employ it.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. Go ahead, John. Take this. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, we in a past episode, and it was episode 7 of our podcast, we did speculate a little bit about the possibility of sibling sexual abuse, which would imply that perhaps Alex sexually abused Lori. But we have no proof of that. That would be pure speculation. The family culture is consistent with that type of abuse, but that would still be a little bit of a stretch. But I think it would go a long way toward explaining why Lori might have so much leverage over Alex. I mean, I can't imagine that you would just ask your brother to go kill kids and they would just willingly oblige, right? So it is a little peculiar.
I think one thing too, I think the question, I think we would agree with the question, but it's still a question, right? They do seem a little too close. We agree with that. What that means, we can't say for certain. But we can say that we talk a lot about the Cox family dynamics in which episode is it? Episode 7. We talk about the Cox family dynamics where they didn't have boundaries at all. And we talk about narcissistic families and what it means to be a narcissistic family and the secrets that you keep and the secrets that you keep hidden and how the family members can become enmeshed and, you know, and that would play a part in, go ahead.
Yeah, the clinical term in family therapy, the clinical term is enmeshment. And that means essentially that the members' identities are completely bound up in one another. So it's hard for members of a family like this to separate themselves from each other. There's no real differentiation between one family member and the other. So families like that really hold their secrets tight. You know, they close ranks from the world, from the outside world, and they have all these secrets and all these dysfunctions, and they'll do everything in their power to prevent those things from getting out. So enmeshed families are also more likely to have abuse too, so sexual abuse. So you know, it's hard to know for sure why they're so close. There does definitely seem to be something unusual in their relationship. And yeah, I know Pryor keeps trying to he keeps trying to go down that path, but you know, presumably he knows something we don't, I guess.
Yeah, and you know, this is something we didn't speak with you about before coming on here, but speaking of Pryor, you know, I'm not a fan of him. I think anybody who follows Twitter knows that.
Right.
On our Facebook groups, and he's not one of my favorite people, but he is doing his job. And like you said, Dr. John, you've actually worked with the defense in the past. Yeah. Do you have any input on Pryor's angle he's taking or anything like that?
Let me just say, before I answer this question, let me just say this is not a defense I would want to work for. So
right.
Let me be clear about that. There's some sexual assault charges in his past, and that is not an attorney I really would want to align with. So
right.
We agree with you.
So I hope he doesn't give me a call anytime soon. But yeah, I don't, you know, it's a really interesting question. Yeah, because I've had defense attorneys ask me, you know, psychologically, where would you go with this? And I mean, most defense attorneys are going to try to blame everyone else. And I think that's essentially what he's trying to set up. He's going to blame Alex for murders. He's going to argue that Alex and Lori were extremely close and connected and that Chad wasn't a part of that alliance. And then, you know, perhaps they kept that secret from him, maybe. That, I mean, I'm sure he's going to try to set up a scenario where Chad is an outsider and he wasn't privy to all this information and somehow they just landed in his yard by accident or something like that. I mean, he's not going to say that, obviously, but I think he seems to be moving in the direction of, you know, of throwing Lori under the bus by showing this just really close and dysfunctional relationship with Alex that Chad didn't really know about, I think.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. It's going to be interesting to watch that one. I'm sorry, go.
Oh, I see a statement by Glowing Ember, and it's interesting. Yeah, the sexual abuse thing is interesting. What he seems to be fixated on, if it's true, you know, about this Alex Lori relationship. Again, you know, we're speculating now. What seems to be that would play into, I think, what John's suggesting might happen because he wants to also portray Lori and her family as dysfunctional. That would only help the defense, would it not, John?
Well, and if he goes in that direction, he could argue that maybe he's going to argue that Tylee, that Alex did this on his own because Tylee knew too much, and that, you know, maybe Tylee knew about their relationship. I don't know. You know, there's
give a different motive.
Right. I think ultimately he's probably trying to. They're all going to try to pin it on Alex because he's not alive. So it seems like
Right.
the easiest out, but whether the problem they're going to have is they have to convince a jury.
Mhm.
So you can spin any narrative you want, but you're not going to convince a jury unless that narrative is convincing.
Right. Right.
Even if it's circumstantial evidence, you still have to provide a convincing story with evidence that makes sense.
Mhm. Christina, do you have any more questions? I know I have tons that I just keep thinking of off the top of my head.
Ask away.
What are your thoughts on the reason behind them killing the kids?
Sorry, a cricket snuck in. I watched it. I watched a cricket sneak into our door, and now it's singing, and it's driving me crazy. What is the motive behind the kids? What is the reason? Well, there are multiple.
Yeah, we spent so much time thinking about that. At what level? Since we do the hidden podcast, we're always kind of interested in digging really deep to find the deeper, motivations. But I think at the surface level, the motivations are kind of the classic greed, lust, revenge type motivations. But as you start digging a little deeper, I think you start finding some other things. One of the things with Chad that we'll be talking about in our upcoming podcast is the fact that he worked in a cemetery for most of his adult life. And while you might say, okay, so what? Like, what? The reason why that's really important with Chad is because he's very high on this thing called disgust sensitivity, meaning that he doesn't like things that most of us probably don't like dead bodies or rotting corpses, and yet he chooses to work in a cemetery where he's around bodies. And the other thing that happens by him working in a cemetery for so long, and many years he worked there, is he's around death a lot. And we know there's a lot of psychological research supporting the idea that death anxiety creates a lot of problems with people, especially people like Chad that are kind of closed-minded. So what happens with Chad by being around death a lot is that I think it gives him a lot of time and energy to develop his entire belief system. That he starts writing his books, he starts developing these ideas about zombies and his system of judging light and dark, and being around death all the time, I think, is like the worst thing that could have happened to Chad Tabel, because he's not the type of person that's going to do well in that environment. So if you're looking for a deeper reason, a hidden reason as to why Chad moved in this direction, I think you really have to look closely at the fact that he was in a job that he was not suited for, that created a lot of problems for him, I think, psychologically and emotionally. And one of his responses to that was to develop this whole kind of, bizarre belief system that piggybacked on the Mormon religion, obviously, but was way different than most tenets of Mormonism. And to try to make it viable, that he was the deity who was in charge of this whole thing. He saw himself as a prophet. And I think a lot of that is a response to being in cemeteries for so long. So so that would be, I think that would provide some of the deeper reasons for Chad.
Some more basic, still deep, but more basic reasons, like on more, on the surface motives, why they were both killed when they were killed. Because as a journalist, I think Tylee was first because multiple reasons. She knew too much. She knew way too much. She knew about Charles. She pushed back on Chad. Chad definitely had some misogyny, some disliked women or girls with opinions, or there's definitely that played a part. He probably hated Tylee. She knew too much. And I think also, I think in some ways it was a sacrifice to see how far would Lori go. Would she kill her kids for me? I think JJ was next simply because he was hard. Like they didn't, again, Chad would be a stepfather to these children, and he wanted Lori all to himself. And why have, he didn't want to give resources or time to JJ. He wanted his new lover to himself, which he said, we know that he told somebody, Chad told someone, my new wife is hot and loaded. He felt that Lori was somebody he deserved and always wanted, that he, and I think that why he didn't want the kids, why, he found the woman, he wanted her to himself and didn't want to deal with JJ. Maybe John can talk more about that or explain anything I didn't, but those would be the more less hidden motives.
In our last episode, we actually compare Lori to Diane Downs, who I don't know if you guys know who that is, but she murdered one of her kids back in like 1983. She was out for a drive. She put her kids in the back of her car. She pulled the car over and she shot them all. Fortunate, I mean, this isn't fortunate, but she killed one of her kids. The other two survived. So fortunately, two of the kids made it. However, the reason she did it is because she was dating this guy who was married, and his name was Richard Knickerbocker. They called him Nick, but Nick said he didn't want kids and that he couldn't have a relationship with her if she had kids. So she went out and tried to kill her kids. And psychologists have done some research on that and shown there's this thing called homicide adaptation theory, which is that parents that are not the biological parents often see children that are not theirs as a cost. And I think Chad was in that predicament. Chad was like Nick, as Nick was to Diane Downs. Chad saw these children as cost. He didn't want to invest in them. He wanted Lori to himself. And I know this is all really harsh, but it seems like there's some reality to that he just wanted the kids out of the way. We feel pretty confident in saying that Chad was the one who probably suggested murdering the children.
It makes sense. I mean, Lori moved there. It was the 1st of September, right, Christina?
Yeah.
So within a week of moving there, a little over, 7 days, September 8th was the last day that Tylee was seen alive. And then within 3 weeks of moving there, September 22nd was the last day that JJ was seen alive. So as soon as Lori got up to Chad's neck of the woods, it seemed the kids were eliminated.
Right. I know that's horrible. But yeah, we feel pretty strongly that Chad was the lead on that Chad really did not want to deal with these kids. Here he finds this quote hot and loaded woman that he thinks is a goddess, and he doesn't want to deal with her children.
This would totally be an opinion when I ask you this. Do you think Lori would have known that before going to Idaho? I don't know if that's even something you've ever thought about. That's something that just popped in my head. I never.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Somebody asked us the question, if Tammy was poisoned by Chad, do you think that Chad expressed that Chad had talked about the fact that he saw himself in another life, and he talked about the fact that he believed that at some point Tammy would pass away. Did he tell her that before he killed her?
Tell Tammy that.
Right.
He thought he would die.
So your question reminds me of that a little bit, right? Like, did Lori know that Chad wanted these kids dead before she went up there? I'd have to think that there was probably some talk of that. I think that, he labeled Tylee as a zombie well before they had moved up to Rexburg, and from their system, if you're labeled a zombie, things aren't going to go well for you. So,
or he labeled her as dark.
Well, he actually called her a zombie.
Called her a zombie, yeah, and labeled her as dark a long time before.
Right. Before Lori moved to Rexburg.
So my personal opinion, just looking at the case, I think she might have known that Tylee was next, but they had to move to Rexburg, right? Because if they stayed in Arizona, everyone would notice she was, right? She had to get her away from everyone that would notice she was missing. So to me, this is coming from Lauren's speculation. I think that Lori likely knew that Tylee was going to be killed before they moved.
Yeah, I would guess there was probably some discussions about that.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I just can't even wrap my head around that. Maui Girl asks, do you have any thoughts on why Alex married Zulema? Is it Zulema? I've heard it pronounced both ways. So
yeah, I say Zulema and he says Zulema. So
yeah.
There you go.
Right. I say tomato.
So I'll call her Zulema and she calls her Zulema. Zulema is one person that I wish would talk, and I think her silence shows you that she knows a lot. I think if she didn't, she would be talking. We talked to someone close to the case last week, and this person essentially said that while they think Lori, Alex, and Chad knew everything, they think Zulema and Melanie Pulowski knew a lot. That doesn't answer your question about why Alex married Zulema. I don't know. We're still digging into that, and we do want to find out why. But I will tell you this. I think Zulema was a big part of this, and it's interesting that she gets left out.
Yeah, she's not discussed enough, I think. But I mean, everything about that is so bizarre because her son, the whole thing with her son didn't even know who Alex was, right?
Right, it was crazy.
So to not answer Maui Girl's question, we don't know yet, but we are working on it. So stick with us. We are digging to find out why.
I think that's something we've looked at that before as well. Christina, how many marriages did she have? I think it's 5. Oh, she just messaged me that she had to step away for a second. Was it 5? Do you guys know off the top of your head? I think it's 5.
I thought it was like 6 or 7, but I don't have. I knew it was a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
it was a high number.
It was track after 4 or 5.
Right. Something's not right there,
Yeah,
people
exactly.
just don't keep getting married and then just spontaneously marry Alex Cox and then he's dead. It's just, there's something way off about that. And she was an energy healer, and one of her jobs was a professional cuddler.
Right, exactly. It's been, someone believes, we can't confirm this, but I'll just say this, someone close to the case believes that Zulema even maybe knew that Alex was going to try to kill somebody that, along with Melanie Pulowski. But
I believe it.
Yeah, and that's hard to say. I'm trying to keep the sources and but
right.
Yeah, I think she knows a lot. So I think this is pure speculation. We want to dig and find out. This is pure speculation, but clearly I think I wouldn't be surprised if Chad suggested this marriage, as he was sort of like this oracle and calling the shots. If he said, Zulema and Alex get married, they probably would have done it, but just an idea.
I would believe that. I definitely would. I guess that brings us to, we discussed this on the phone a little bit, and I'll let you both explain this aspect of the case and your interpretation of it when it comes to Alex? And would hypersexuality be the correct word for that? Or just his behavior over years sexually?
Yeah. Well, yeah. In terms of the work I do, one of the biggest risk factors for sexual problems is what's called sexual preoccupation. So I think that would be hypersexuality would be a similar way of saying that. But yeah, sexual preoccupations for sure. That he probably was using sex as a way of coping with. It was probably a type of self-medication for him, I think, to some degree. It was probably a way for him to seek affection in some ways, as dysfunctional as that is. But yeah, he had really poor boundaries around sex. And
there's a story we heard from Alex Cox's friend. We've talked to one of Alex Cox's close friends, someone that's also been at the Cox household as well. She knew the whole family. She's mentioned some interesting things, including this is something we never told anyone else because this is kind of random, including she thought it was strange that while at a dinner at the Cox household with Alex, she was invited by Alex, that Lori wore a bikini the whole time. So enjoy that little tidbit. But she said that Alex, kind of had inappropriate, he was a comedian, but he kind of had inappropriate sexual comments all the time. He was always joking, and he would make sexual jokes that made this friend kind of uncomfortable, whatever. She just kind of didn't care. She just kind of ignored it. One joke in particular that he kind of repeated a lot to her had to do with masturbation. And again, she would just brush it aside and ignore it as Alex being Alex. But then she heard him tell the same joke to both his mother and grandmother. And she couldn't believe that. She just was so shocked at the family dynamics there that someone would tell a joke like that to their mother, and not just their mother, but their grandmother. And we kind of agreed with that we were shocked as well. To hear that, it kind of shows again that the Cox family household clearly had no boundaries and no sexual boundaries, which would imply that there was some strange relationships in that family, and would go along with that theory as well. That this family is enmeshed, has no boundaries, probably has quite a few secrets, and you could go on and on. But
and their sexual acting out, there's really poor sexual boundaries. They're using sex in very unhealthy ways to cope with family dysfunctions and dysfunctional emotions.
Yeah, it totally aligns with all of the documents. I don't know if Christina's still away or not, but for anybody who did not know, Christina is the one who did all the hard work and digging and obtaining all those documents for WTAF. But
well done. Yeah.
For those who haven't seen them, when you read those documents, there is such a strong underlying sexual tone throughout most of the documents. And it's very alarming, and it begins with Lori. And then when you hear these things about Alex, and then, you kind of question the family dynamics, what was going on there in the Cox household, that led these people to grow up to be who they were.
Right. Yeah, I think with Lori, sex was a way of getting her needs met. I think it was more a manipulative thing with her. That she, this is kind of a stereotypical interpretation, but she's someone who used sex to, manipulate men and get her way, essentially. And that seems to be accurate, I think.
And she clearly learned that somewhere, though. She learned that was a power she could use, in the Cox household.
Right. Yeah. That comes from, I think that's often or can be a function of borderline personality disorder as well.
That's interesting. I didn't know that about borderline personality disorder. Madam Deficit asked another question. What do you make of the behavior exhibited by Chad's children? Have you taken a look at their behavior and what they don't say and what they do, and just some of the
right.
stuff?
It's interesting that most recently Emma Daybell, right, has made her background photo on her Facebook profile 2 raccoons. You know, that was shocking.
Disgusting. Yeah.
So we, as you know, again, we have talked to sources on every side of this case. We'll just say that, like, we are continuing to talk. We have heard that the Daybell kids have been fed a very different story than what is the truth. And that is hard to fathom too, because you're like, but there were bodies found in their yard. Come on. There's been some people that have said that they've been told, or somehow still believe, that the remains might be animal remains, that they don't even believe it's JJ and Tylee. Whether that's true or not, I can't confirm, but it would go with their behavior.
It's consistent with the picture of 2 raccoons.
Right.
Right. So there's some
why they wouldn't believe, I think, goes along with their mother's been murdered. Like, these are 5 very sheltered, very naive children. In order for them to face what their father has done, their entire realities, their entire life and reality as they know it would be obliterated. And I think that they are in absolute denial because they're simply holding on to, Chad is the only thing they have left in hopes of some sort of normalcy. If they, it would be a murder of their mother, a murder of children. John can talk to you a little bit about the psychology behind a denial like this, when the facts are, we think of them as in your face facts and they don't see it that way.
Yeah, I think there's a huge level of denial simply because they're clinging to the hope that maybe their father will get released and that, all of this is a big mistake. And, I don't think these kids were prepared to deal with the reality of this. As Lauren said, it seems like these kids were really sheltered. They're really naive. They just, they were living in like this alternative universe. And now they're hit with this huge, unfathomable reality that, their mother was murdered by their dad, who then turned around and remarried someone and murdered a couple of children. So.
And it's confirmation bias, we think that facts, we always think, well, the truth will set you free. And that's not often true. It's, or what do you say? Seeing is believing, John says, but that's not true with confirmation bias. Believing is seeing, he says, instead.
I had one of my supervisors in grad school used to always say that the cliche about seeing is believing is completely wrong. It's actually believing is seeing. And I think, you have a situation like that here, that these kids really don't want to believe the reality of this because it's just too hard. As Kendra is saying in your question, it's too painful to deal with. I think these kids want to cling to the hope that their dad is going to get released and that he didn't do this. And that in fact, these are 2 raccoons that were found in the yard and not 2 children's bodies. So yeah, it's a tough one.
So they'll go to any place to hold on to, believing is seeing for them. In other words, they're going to decide what they believe and that's what they're going to see.
Right. They're seeing it through the lens of their father, whom they think is still a great guy and incapable of doing this.
Wow. I mean, it totally makes sense. You never want to believe anything like that. I can't imagine my parents doing, my one of my parents doing something like that.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that, you know, if you look at it through your own lens, that's the way to kind of, you know,
Right.
make sense of it. Like, I don't think if someone came to me and said, your dad murdered your mother and then he murdered 2 kids in your front yard, I'd probably do a lot of believing a scene for a while myself. Probably not if the bodies were found. I think I would be better than that. But again, these kids are sheltered and they're naive. So.
Yeah. Okay. I think Christina had another question she wanted to ask you.
Yes. Just based on the sources you've spoke to and what you've gathered, what is your opinion, or how much do you think Tammy was aware of?
I don't think she was aware of a lot. I really don't. There was probably a lot of believing a scene with Tammy too. I think she didn't want to see a lot of things in her marriage and in Chad that she didn't want to see. I think we all know that Charles wrote her about a possible affair. I think that there's an idea that she suspected the affair, but I think she did not know a lot.
She probably didn't want to know a lot. I mean,
she didn't want to know a lot.
She seems to have known about the affair. How seriously she took it, we don't know. I think your idea here is a good one, that if she did know and she was confronting Chad with it, the timing of that would be interesting for sure. But
right.
He didn't seem too concerned about getting caught either, though, walking around, the track with holding hands with Lori. I think that gives us an idea of what type of person Tammy was too. I think if she saw things for what they were, he'd have been a little bit more afraid, if she had confronted him more over the years. But I don't know.
Yeah, she tended to be a little passive in that relationship. There's some stories in Chad's autobiography where he talks about how, on the one hand, he was worried about how Tammy might respond to certain revelations that he would bring her, but on the other hand, he saw her as very submissive. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but she probably was pretty submissive with Chad.
We've heard from multiple sources that are close to the Daybell family that when it came to the Chad and Tammy relationship, that Chad believed that Tammy did what he told her to. That was, how people saw that relationship.
It seems like that after reading Chad's autobiography. I mean, it definitely seemed like Tammy held that family together, and Chad would get a job and quit that job and decide he didn't like it. And she seemed to be very passive with him, and he just did what he wanted and he worked when he wanted. And poor
Right.
Tammy, because I don't know, I don't know what her background was growing up, but
I think that Tammy, she was raised Mormon. I think, I know that Mormons are raised to be, Mormon women are raised to be dutiful wives, to stand by their husbands. Divorce is really discouraged. To forgive. There's a lot of talk about forgiveness. There's a talk about, being the kinder, more forgiving person in the relationship a woman is. And I think that Tammy probably did what she was raised to do, which is stick with her marriage and work hard. And she's probably a martyr in many ways, just kind of accepting the odd guy that Chad was with his revelations, and probably just kept on going, if that makes sense. Just doing what she was raised to do. Be a dutiful.
it does.
Yeah.
It was very ingrained in her to be submissive.
Yes. And you know
So-
what? Crazy as that is too, you know, Lori was also raised Mormon, and although she's very, very different than Tammy, I think you brought up the point that Lori was also raised to be submissive. And while we see her as a flamboyant murderer, and you know, man eater in many ways, you know, in Black Widow, she too was raised to be submissive and to know that her role as a woman was probably to, you know, was next to that of her husband and to do what her husband says. And so it's something to think about with Lori too, as strange as that is, it is that right, that is, you know, what the LDS church does teach, you know. So sort of the so Lori also had those teachings, so it would imply that if Chad was telling her what to do, she would have those teachings ingrained in her as well.
Yeah, it makes complete sense.
Amen to barking dogs. Exactly.
Yeah. So on one of your episodes, I'm not sure, I know some people in the chat are not familiar with your podcast, so we're sharing the link down there. If you guys have not listened, you definitely need to check out their podcast. It's amazing.
Thank you.
One of the episodes that was really, they're all amazing, but the topic of filicide.
Yeah.
And that kind of applies to both Lori and then Chad with step-parent filicide. Do you have an opinion? I know everybody tries to, not everybody, I shouldn't say that. It does seem like Lori and Chad are going to try to pin this on Alex. But do you have an opinion on whether Lori and Chad both killed these children? One of them killed them?
So do you mean like actually physically murdering the kids?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. We were talking about that with someone today, earlier today, and I think it's possible. I think we all kind of look in the direction of Alex as the murderer, as the actual hands-on murderer. But with Lori's rage and with Chad's narcissism, yeah, I think it's possible that Chad and Lori could have had a hands-on part of this. And, you know, we know that Chad was out in the backyard disfiguring these bodies, or at least helping Alex disfigure the bodies. So burn the bodies, right? Like, if you're willing to do that, you're probably capable of murdering someone. So whether they can actually prove that is a different question. But is it possible that they actually were hands-on murderers and a part of this? For sure.
Yeah, and we can't determine that we don't know, but I think anything's possible.
I agree. I'm of the opinion that Tylee, when they left Yellowstone on September 8th, I don't think she ever left the vehicle after they left Yellowstone. That's just my opinion. That's what my instincts say.
I can see that. I can see that totally. I've thought about that. Yeah.
Do you think she was killed in the park?
I'm not sure. I think she was killed in the vehicle.
Okay.
After they left the park. That's just my opinion. Possibly killed in the park and put into the vehicle. Right. But due to her age, it would be harder to murder Tylee inside the condo and then get her out of the house undetected versus JJ, who was younger.
Right.
That's just, you know, I think something happened either at the end of their Yellowstone trip or on the way home from Yellowstone back to the condo. And then you see Alex at Lori's apartment based on phone pings. I'm not convinced that he did the murdering.
Yeah. I think you're speculating is possible. So
yeah, I agree. I think it's undersold how likely Chad and or Lori were capable of committing the murders.
Right. I agree. Let's see what the chat has going on down here. Is there anything else you guys want to touch on? Anything?
Do you want to talk about what's coming up? We have not yet recorded our episode that's coming out soon, but the notes John has on it is impressive, and what we've been talking about is impressive. And so we're going to maybe tell them about what's coming, what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So this next episode is actually we're going to tie together the pieces. We're going to develop a bit of a timeline for both Chad and Lori, more of a psychological timeline that lays out some of their motivations, and try to figure out how the two of them together were able to do this in the end. So we'll look at each of them individually. We've done that through our first 10 episodes, but this will be the first episode where we actually bring them both into play, and we try to figure out what we now call the dance of death, that their dance of death, right? How the two of them could come together, the two of them being greater than each of them separately and more capable of murder as a couple, but how they as a couple were able to do this. And we'll be digging deep into that in the next episode.
That'll definitely be interesting to hear, because I've always wondered how Chad and Lori even ended up together. I don't, when you read his books, they're god awful. They're horrible. And how she could ever become fascinated with a man who wrote books like that is beyond my scope of understanding, because I look at him and I'm like, gross.
Right.
And
how Chad Daybell had even one cult member is mind-boggling.
Right.
Right. I mean, yeah, I agree. And I make the joke about, we've read his books because we've had to understand him, but man, it's not kind on the brain.
Oh, they're awful, aren't they? They're like, reading them is just like, when I first read them, I wanted to throw. I was reading them on a Kindle. I'm like, I can't even. This guy's so arrogant. What did Lori see in him? How did this happen?
Yeah.
And I know religion plays a role in it.
Right.
I just don't understand how she went from her standard LDS beliefs to Chad's beliefs. And so that'll be an interesting episode to hear your guys' take on how they came to be.
Yeah.
Just a quick thought on that question, by the way. So we think it was around 2015. It might have been a little earlier than that, but the first time Lori picked up one of Chad's books, and became enamored with his book, it was probably An Errand for Emma, or it was probably a book in that series, because that's when he was writing them, around that time. But for whatever reason, that really resonated with her. And I think from there on out, she started reading all of his books, and she became a big fan, and she created this fantasy, right? She created this really elaborate fantasy about Chad, and how special he was, and how she needed to meet him. And that fantasy had years to develop and to percolate before she met him. So by the time she met him, she was primed to fall in love with him in a way. She just needed him to kind of manipulate her a little bit.
And we do talk about in our episode too, like what she did see in him, and we'll talk about it more in our next episode that actually plays a part, but we do share like what it was. And it was essentially that he offered her, this idea that she was a deity and that she was this queen of sorts. And that meant more to her than a lot.
Right. And that they as a couple would run the New Jerusalem, and they would be, like a king and a queen, and they would be in charge of everything. I mean, he offered this vision of immortality. She was top.
Yeah, that's interesting because when you look at Lori's past relationships, she seemed to chase at least Joseph Ryan and Charles Vallow were both financially okay.
Right. Yeah.
Chad was not. He
Right.
literally had nothing financially to offer her
Yeah.
besides his wife's insurance policy when she died. So
Right.
it's interesting that Lori got to the point that seeing herself as what you referenced became more important to her than what appeared to be in her past. Money was the importance.
Yeah, I really think it was, and I see this so much in when I evaluate, felons and criminals, that it's the fantasy that drives a lot of these behaviors. It's this fiction, right? This fantasy that they're creating about, like, I know this might be an extreme example, but like a pedophile will develop a fantasy about having a relationship with an 8-year-old. That's obviously not based in reality at all, right? And not in any way, not legally, socially, psychologically, right? There's no way in which that could ever work. And yet that fantasy propels them forward. They see signs in that 8-year-old that clearly tell them that the 8-year-old's in love with them or whatever, right? So they're not living in the real world. And I think you see some of that, or a lot of that, with Lori, that when she encounters Chad's books and she's overtaken with this fantasy or this apocalyptic world that he's creating, that she's really, really drawn to that. And it's that fantasy that's propelling her towards him, not anything realistic that has to do with Chad Tabel.
Huh. That's, yeah, very interesting. So, Christina, do you have any other questions you want to ask them, or does anybody in the chat have anything? This case literally still, I mean, if I were to add up the thousands of documents we have, I think we're at about 3,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
On top of everything that we learned along the way, it's one of those things you don't even know where to begin with questions sometimes because there's so many.
Yeah.
Did you ever, I know Annie, Joseph Ryan's sister, had spoke about Tylee's behavior in the interview room. Did you ever get a chance to watch that video when Lori was interrogated? Not really, she wasn't even really interrogated. It was more a friendly interview. When her and Melanie Gibb and Tylee were at the police station.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever have...
Before Charles was killed? So
yes. Did you notice anything with Tylee's physical behavior that would imply that she was uncomfortable? Or
I noticed with Tylee, so first off, Tylee has to play their game a bit, right? Like, Tylee was raised in this. She was raised by Lori. She knows she has to play Lori's game, right? But Tylee actually did seem uncomfortable a lot of times when Melanie or Lori were lying. They were at the police station, and there were times with her hands when she was kind of like, okay, like with her mother, like, okay, hold on, mom, like, that's not what happened. She was kind of being the grown-up. She was kind of being the adult, and it was almost like she was trying to manage both Lori and Melanie, what they were saying, and along with them when, like, Lori's like, oh, she wants to be a police officer, and the police officer was like, oh, is that true, Tylee? And she's like, yeah, maybe. She kind of like learned how to go along with her mom and whatever her mom's saying, but at the same time, Tylee, you could tell, had a conscience and liked facts a lot more than her mother liked facts. She wasn't trying to manipulate like Lori was trying to manipulate, and so there were times where she kind of put her hands on her mother, sort of like, oh, like you would with a child, like, okay, calm down, or hold on here just a minute. You know, it was interesting that she kind of took on a mother role, in my opinion.
And she was using some humor to diffuse the situation. I think you can see that Tylee's kind of caught in the middle of a lot of this, that Tylee is more grounded in reality than her mother, for sure. And yet she has to appease her mother at the same time. So I think that must have been really hard for Tylee. My guess is that Tylee saw through Chad, completely saw through him. And she may have been expressing that to Lori at some point, and that probably didn't play too well in Rexburg with Chad. So
Yeah, I can't imagine that it would. Poor Tylee. Poor Tylee. And JJ.
I know.
Right. Did you see anything in that video that you wanted to bring up or that you noticed? Or
she seemed to be self-soothing.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know, that again brings me back to the documents. Tylee went through hell in her life with her mother.
Yeah.
And all that Lori put her through. And it's very sad to look at that video and see the effects. You know, you can see just different mannerisms that Tylee had. Did you notice anything, Christina?
Yeah. It was almost like she already knew what she was going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good point.
I definitely see the self-soothing too that you bring up. They're both important.
Yeah, and when you read all the court documents and the professionals speaking about Tylee being coached, you know, like Christina said.
Yeah.
Tylee, it was like she knew what to say, like Lori had coached her beforehand, and it's just all really sad. It's all very, very, very sad.
Right.
What was that?
Not saying what she was supposed to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. And she's probably been trained to do that since she was a toddler, right? Even being coached to say that her dad, you know, abused her when he really hadn't. Tylee's entire life was being trained what to say and when to say it. So she kind of came and teased her mother, but yeah, she definitely wasn't okay with it. You can see that in the video. Like she wasn't always comfortable with it, and there was, I'm sure, a lot of self-soothing. Yeah.
And just quickly on this question here, by deficit, we definitely think that Chad believed he was a prophet. I just reread his autobiography the last few days, and he's all in on his on his New Jerusalem and being a prophet. I think he actually wrote his autobiography to try to sell that perspective to people, but I think he believes it. And we have from really good sources, we've heard from really good sources that he absolutely believes every word that he's written and said. And so, yeah, I think some of it could be a manipulation, but most of it is that he believes it.
That makes sense. So thank you guys so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for what you do.
No problem. Do you want to tell everybody where to find your podcast? That we've shared the links down to your Facebook, your Apple Podcasts, and your Twitter and Instagram, I believe. But so Hidden is available. Is it available on all platforms?
There's always obscure platforms we don't know about when people say, hey, but for let's say all well-known platforms, it is available. Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, where else? Yes, it should be available most places. Our main place or our current website for now is hiddentruecrime.podbean.com. That's our host, and that's where we post the original. So Podbean as in BEAN.com. And then I don't know if you mentioned our YouTube. We have a YouTube channel now. It's our podcast.
Oh, great.
Hidden True Crime is that. And then you mentioned our Facebook. That's facebook.com/hidden true crime. And we do have it. We have an Instagram as well, sharing a little bit more about just us and our life as well as this podcast. And that's also Hidden True Crime, the handle Hidden True Crime. So
wonderful.
Well, I think you covered it.
Yeah, and we want to start doing, we want to do at the end of this season, our season Beyond the Veil, about Chad and Lori, YouTube live ourselves, where we'll answer listeners' questions. And so stick with us, and we hope to start doing those soon as well.
That is amazing. I wish you guys the best.
Thank you.
And I look forward to listening to more. I'm definitely going to message you, and Christina and I will message you. I'm going to send you all the documents that you don't have so that you have them all. And maybe you'll find something in there to help you with your investigating there.
Dr. John is always finding the new thing. I will get papers, right? Like, I'm like you guys, I'm a journalist. You guys are incredible journalists yourself, getting all these documents. And I'll look at things. I'll be like, can you believe this? Can you believe this? And look at this and read this. And he'll pick out the most obscure thing, in my opinion, in the document and be like, do you see this? This means, and then he goes off on some, and I'm like, really? So, yes, I'll tell you, he will find new stuff, believe me. So thank you.
That's awesome.
Thank you for your incredible investigative work and in gathering. I'm, as a journalist, I'm very impressed with what you ladies found and discovered. So good job.
Thank you. So on that note, I think we're going to say good night, guys.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us, and until next time.
Yes, until next time. And for everybody down in the chat, thank you for being here. And for everybody who sent prayers and love and well wishes to my son, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. It means the world to me. He had surgery a couple days ago. Actually, was it yesterday? Everything's a blur. So he is on the mend and recovering, and I appreciate your patience with us not being here on YouTube. We're back. You're going to see a lot of new faces on here because all of the members of WTAF are going to be joining the lives. So everybody have a good night. And Christina, thanks for coming on tonight. And to the bomb squad down there and all the F-bombers, I hope you guys all have a great night and a great weekend.
Thanks, ladies. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Night, guys.